throughout the day as APIs. I also asked about the Food and Drug Administration's managing its foreign inspection regime. The Government Accountability Office has said that the FDA does conduct some unannounced inspections overseas, but they don't have data on the frequency. However, Government Accountability Office noted in 2019 that the FDA estimated that they generally provided 12 weeks of notice before the inspection. So simply said, FDA then is undermining the ability of field inspectors to do their jobs. 12 weeks, common sense tells me, is plenty of time to doctor up a facility to make sure that it passes inspection. Yet, incredibly, some facilities still get caught. That's how bad it is, and we have to do something about it. The end result is that the consumer is put at risk. According to the most recent FDA data, the United States has 46% of finished dosage form facilities. That's where API are turned into final form, such as tablets. That means over 50% of the sites manufacturing finished drugs are located outside the United States. But that's just part of the story. What we really need to know is, where did the API come from? According to the most recent FDA data, 13% comes from China, 19% from India. Combined, that's more than any other country. And overall, then, more than 70% of facilities that make APIs are located overseas. These figures, coupled with the COVID pandemic, have garnered a lot of attention, including what might need to be done from a national security standpoint. But the figures do not make clear what needs to be done about a drug safety perspective. We need to have a robust and aggressive foreign inspection program. Now, with respect to China and India, both those countries have had serious quality control problems. We all remember the valsartan recall, where that drug was found to contain contaminants used in rocket fuel. Facilities in China and India produce that drug. So we should not also forget heparin, and that's a scandal all by itself. In that case, patients undergoing dialysis began to have severe and life-threatening side effects because a manufacturing plant in China introduced a toxin into the production chain. Hundreds of people died, and hundreds were sick. And then we have Ranbaxy, an Indian manufacturer. Ranbaxy's production chain exposed drugs to potential cross-contamination by penicillin and used APIs from facilities that were not approved by the FDA. That company also manufactured Lipitor and was shut down because it could not explain why some of those tablets had pieces of glass in them. I fear these examples are just the tip of the iceberg. They show why the FDA must maintain an aggressive inspection regime to ensure drug quality, but at the same time also impose a strong enforcement regime on bad actors. In February of this year, FDA Commissioner Han told me that in fiscal year 2018, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research issued almost 5 times as many warning letters to human drug manufacturers as compared to 2015. He said that's a sign that FDA is better able to use its resources to identify problems. Now that's very good. Stay aggressive and don't hesitate to be more aggressive. On the front end, though, that process should include unannounced inspection overseas. After all, why would we give manufacturers time to prepare their facilities for inspection? They ought to be looking over their shoulder every day. That would keep them honest. During the Obama administration, the FDA started what was called the India pilot program. It allowed for no warning inspections or couple days worth of warning. Under it, the FDA issued a 60% increase in what's termed official action indicated findings. In 2015, the Obama administration shut the pilot program down, and I believe that there was no explanation of why. It sounds like the program was a victim of its own success. Now, this issue is a very bipartisan issue. Republican and Democrat administrations have come up short. The Government Accountability Office has a body of work from multiple administrations that prove that this is bipartisan. For example, both Obama and Trump administrations have struggled to fill vacancies in foreign offices. So that brings us today, because what I've just said is what we found out over a year or more of investigations without hearings. Today we have witnesses from the FDA that can speak to all these issues and how the pandemic has impacted their work. On the first panel, we have FDA witnesses and a Government Accountability Office witness. On the second panel, we have private sector companies. So I thank all of you for being here. It's important to note that I plan to follow up with another hearing soon, examining another problematic aspect to our medical supply chain, specifically the increase in trade of fake and faulty personal protective equipment. That is separate from what we will discuss today. In closing, I want to say 2 things. First, thank you to FDA officials that work tirelessly to inspect facilities overseas. Second, regardless of party, we must have an honest discussion of the government's shortcomings so that we can better understand what we as Congress can do to ensure drug safety for the taxpayers. After all, we work for them and must always answer to them. One thing before I introduce Ranking Member Wyden, and that simply is this, that we have one more vote in a series that started at 2:15. We will continue to go through that vote. And we also have a vote at 4:30, and we'll continue to go through that vote. So, Senator Wyden, are you ready?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Would you like me to proceed now?
Yeah, please do.
This afternoon, the Finance Committee is holding its first meeting since March, focusing on the FDA's failure to adequately inspect foreign drug manufacturers for safety. In my view, the head of the FDA ought to be at this hearing to face tough questions on this issue. But FDA Commissioner Hahn is not with us today for one reason, and that is because the Trump administration blocked his testimony. The Trump administration did this to prevent the committee from holding the point person for the FDA accountable. I also asked for the committee to invite the journalist Catherine Eban to testify because she has literally written the book on this issue. That also, unfortunately, is not happening. In lieu of that, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record testimony and articles from Ms. Eban on this subject. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While the committee meets for this hearing, COVID-19 is ripping through nursing homes and killing thousands of Americans each week. Unemployment is at near depression levels. The kindling laid down over the centuries of racial injustice was reignited by the murder of George Floyd. The president is agitating for more violence and more escalation as our nation suffers. The injustice driving peaceful protesters to the streets over the last few days is woven throughout society. Since the committee is dealing with healthcare in this hearing, I'm going to start my remarks with an immediate piece of urgently needed healthcare reform. COVID-19 has hit the African American community harder than virtually any other group of Americans. I would note in a recent analysis that was described in the Washington Post, it showed that counties that are majority Black have 3 times the rate of infections and almost 6 times the rate of deaths as counties where white residents are in the majority. The racial injustice status quo is simply immoral. There's a long and terrible history of our healthcare system working against Black people in America. From simply not listening when symptoms are reported, up to performing cruel experiments on Black human beings. That's part of why COVID-19 is having such an outsized impact on the African American community. There's a risk, for example, that when a COVID-19 vaccine becomes available, vaccination rates in the African American community may be lower because many in the community, for understandable reasons, do not believe that American healthcare is really looking out for them, is really going to give them a fair shake. So I want to make something very clear right now. This committee has real muscle when it comes to federal healthcare spending and doing something about what I just described. $2 trillion in spending in jurisdiction over flagship programs like Medicare and Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and more are inside the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee. So today, in beginning, I'm calling on this committee to come together and use all of that power and authority to right the wrongs of the past that I've described this afternoon. On our watch, this, colleagues, just has to get done. Now, as for the subject of today's hearing, I want to focus on one specific example, the FDA and the president teaming up to put Americans in danger. And I want to talk about hydroxychloroquine. Back in March, with the pandemic exploding nationwide, far-right media began talking about using this old malaria drug to treat COVID-19. The president seized on the reports, without any valid evidence, he spent weeks declaring it to be the ultimate game changer in the fight against this horrible pandemic. The FDA, in my view, bowed to pressure and issued what's called an emergency use authorization for the drug. Doing so throws open the doors to tens of millions of pills, including some directly related to this hearing, manufactured inside facilities in Pakistan and India that have either failed FDA inspection or never been inspected by the FDA at all. Studies have now shown that the drug has no benefit for COVID patients. In fact, it is actually linked to higher rates of COVID-19 mortality. On April 24th, the Food and Drug Administration warned against using the drug in COVID treatments, and they said there were serious, and I quote here, serious and potentially life-threatening heart rhythm problems, unquote. The FDA says it still can be imported from unapproved manufacturing facilities. A recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine said the episode posed, and I quote, fundamental threats to the U.S. drug evaluation process. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to have that article from the New England Journal of Medicine put into the record at this point. The fact is, lots of Americans take this medication to treat other diseases, including lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. It's prescribed by their doctors, part of a valid treatment. They're counting on having a safe supply of their medication. And it seems Donald Trump has pretty much taken that away from them. He repeated a bunch of far-right pundits touting junk science. Now the US market is polluted with tens of millions of hydroxychloroquine doses that may or may not be safe. It's not clear that there's a system in place to distinguish them from other stockpiles that came from unapproved sources. So if you're talking about FDA failures leading to greater risks for Americans, hydroxychloroquine is the case in point. There's also the botched rollout of COVID-19 antibody tests. There's the emergency use authorization for faulty K95 masks that pose a danger to healthcare workers and first responders. There's the fact that the number of FDA inspections of foreign drug manufacturing facilities were already down under the Trump administration. On this committee, we know that there's bipartisan interest in seeing improvements at the FDA. It makes sense for us to build our drug manufacturing capacity in America. However, the Trump administration just handed a big contract for COVID-19 drug manufacturing to a company with no experience manufacturing drugs and no facilities in which to manufacture them. That's not good enough, in my view, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. It's not a good enough plan to help COVID patients who are suffering right now. It also raises questions about how this administration would handle a COVID-19 vaccine if and when a vaccine becomes available. There is much to account for on this issue. The Trump administration's continuing effort to stonewall our oversight by blocking Commissioner Hahn from answering our questions today is preventing real, actual accountability. Still, I want to make it clear to our witnesses who are here or with us, we thank them for doing so, and I look forward to their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
National stakeholders. He leads the Office of Global Policy and Strategy, which is comprised of the Office of Diplomacy and Partnership, the Office of Global Operations, and the Office of Trade, Mutual Recognition, and International Arrangements, which are collectively dedicated to expanding the reach of FDA's global agenda in sustainable and measurable ways. Judith McMakin is Associate Commissioner of Regulatory Affairs and has responsibility for 5,000 staff and operations within the Office of Regulatory Affairs. Office of Regulatory Affairs is FDA's field force supporting FDA's product center through the responsibility including inspections and investigations, criminal investigations, compliance with enforcement, import operations, regulatory science, and field laboratory operations. Dr. Douglas Throckmorton is Deputy Director of Regulatory Programs at the Office of Drug Evaluation and Research. Dr. Throckmorton is a board-certified physician, shares the responsibility for overseeing the regulation of research, development, manufacturing, marketing of prescription over-the-counter and generic drugs in the United States, and ensuring that the benefits of approved drugs outweigh their known risk. Dr. Mary McCauley, actually Denigen McCauley, oversees the U.S. Government Accountability Office's portfolio of audits on public health, private health, and the markets associated with that, including opioid issues. Mary joined GAO in 2001, managing a diverse portfolio related to science and agricultural production and defense and GAO's Natural Resource and Environment team. This work covered cross-cutting topics such as antibiotic resistance, food safety, and emergency preparation. As the witnesses know, we're under time restrictions at the moment, and accordingly, the three FDA witnesses will try to keep their opening statements to a combined 7.5 minutes, and then GAO will have the equal 7.5 minutes. We'll begin with Mr. Chairman? Mr. Abdu.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
If I could, just for a minute, with respect, we still feel for real accountability over all the issues we're discussing today. You've got to have Dr. Hahn. And in fact, all of the employees that you just described, we certainly recognize their role at the FDA. They all report to Dr. Hahn. So respectfully, we have a difference of opinion. I think it's very unfortunate that he's not with us today, because he's the person who's really accountable on the entire array of issues we're discussing today, and I appreciate the chance to respond briefly.
The only thing I would give back to you is that these witnesses are the experts and cover the bases that we're interested in for this hearing. Mr. McAdoo, would you proceed, please?
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the committee. I'm Mark Abdu, Associate Commissioner for Global Policy and Strategy. And as Chairman Grassley noted, I lead FDA's Office of Global Policy and Strategy, which provides oversight, strategic leadership, and policy direction to our global operations, trade and diplomacy activities, and engagement with international stakeholders. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss FDA's international pharmaceutical oversight today. Over the past 30 years, pharmaceutical manufacturing has become increasingly a global enterprise. Beginning in the 1970s, industry moved away from the mainland United States, first to Puerto Rico in response to tax incentives, and then to Europe and nations that were developing at the time, such as China and India, which offer significantly lower labor, energy, and transportation costs. Globalization presented substantial challenges to regulatory oversight. FDA has responded with a comprehensive strategy to facilitate greater coordination and oversight of medical products. In addition to increasing foreign inspections, our efforts have included the following: developing new enforcement and regulatory tools, increasing collaboration with foreign regulators and other stakeholders, developing internationally harmonized standards and standards convergence, educating foreign industry about FDA requirements, and increasing transparency and accountability in the supply chain. Responsibility for addressing these global challenges is distributed across the agency. My office serves as a focal point for FDA-wide coordination and information sharing, and a point of access to multilateral organizations, addresses issues related to international trade of regulated products, negotiates mutual recognition agreements, enters into arrangements that facilitate foreign inspections and the sharing of information with global regulatory counterparts, and manages FDA's foreign offices around the world. We've made progress in recent years in developing the foreign-based inspectorate. Staffing at the foreign offices is at historically high levels. Our foreign offices conduct inspections, particularly unannounced for-cause inspections. They also work with regulatory counterparts in country, engage in outreach, education, and training with industry association to promote good manufacturing practices, including data integrity and quality, and provide boots-on-the-ground data and analysis to inform decision-making at FDA headquarters. In recent years, we also completed the historic mutual recognition agreement between FDA and the European Union, which is now beginning to yield benefits. The MRA enables FDA and EU regulatory authorities to rely on information from routine drug inspections conducted within each other's borders. As implementation continues and more information is exchanged, the MRA will help to further minimize duplication of drug inspections, lower inspection costs, and permit us to devote more resources to other parts of the world where there may be greater risk. We are deeply committed to leveraging all of our resources to protect the reliability and availability of drugs to treat Americans. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today and to answer questions.
I'm sorry, my microphone isn't on. Ms. McMeekin.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee, I am Judith McMeekin, Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs at the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss FDA's Foreign Drug Inspection Program. Protecting public health is the FDA mission, and it is the foundation of all of our work. And Americans can be confident in the quality of FDA-regulated products. Whether a drug or food is produced in the United States or overseas, products must undergo the same rigorous process, and the information must be fully reviewed by our highly trained scientific staff. The FDA inspects manufacturing facilities around the world. As the products we regulate globalize, it is important for us to modernize our policies and processes to ensure that companies, regardless of where they are located, meet the FDA's strict standards. The FDA's drug inspection program shifted from one focused heavily on the U.S.-based facilities through the early 2000s to a program that since 2015 has conducted more foreign than domestic drug inspections. Consistent with domestic oversight, the FDA's strategy for overseeing the safety of imported products is to maximize the agency's public health impact by aligning resource allocations to risk levels and tailoring the use of regulatory tools accordingly. In the foreign arena, the FDA does not draw upon the same enforcement mechanisms or have a comparable level of infrastructure. For example, if a domestic firm refuses inspection, we are able to seek an inspection warrant, but we do not have the same capacity in foreign countries. To supplement our foreign oversight, the agency utilizes additional tools to ensure the safety and efficacy of products, including, but not limited to, import targeting systems, border surveillance, including import alerts, import certification and enhanced import screening to identify products for sampling, and conducting foreign inspections. The FDA optimizes our oversight of foreign manufacturers by leveraging the work of partners with strong regulatory systems and responsible parties in the supply chain. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA continues to utilize and implement alternative inspection tools and approaches while postponing foreign and domestic routine surveillance facility inspections. This approach will continue as conditions warrant, with the exception of certain mission-critical inspections, including pre-approval and for-cause assignments. Importantly, during this interim period, we're evaluating additional ways to conduct our inspectional work that would not jeopardize public safety and protecting both the firms and the FDA staff. FDA is utilizing all available tools to oversee the safety and quality of FDA-regulated products for all Americans. Foreign inspections present the agency with unique challenges, including the hiring and retention of qualified investigators. I am committed to taking an assessment of our inspection process and identifying opportunities for improvement, ways to optimize and streamline processes, using technology and innovation to be more efficient and modernize our approach. I welcome continued discussion with the committee and others. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Now we call on Dr. Mary Dunagan-McCauley.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss our work on FDA's Foreign Drug Inspection Program. The COVID-19 pandemic has called greater attention to the United States' reliance on foreign drug manufacturers and highlights the importance of a secure pharmaceutical supply chain. Like most drugs manufactured for the U.S. market, many that are important for treating COVID-19 are manufactured overseas. This includes antibiotics for secondary respiratory infections and sedatives for ventilating patients. Today, the majority of establishments manufacturing drugs are overseas. Americans must have access to safe and effective drugs. However, we have had long-standing concerns about FDA's ability to oversee the increasingly global supply chain. In 1998, we reported that FDA had significant problems managing its foreign inspection data and conducted infrequent inspections of foreign established compared to what they did domestically. Since then, we have returned to the topic multiple times and found that problems persist. In 2008, for example, we determined that FDA data were not sufficient to know how many foreign drug establishments were subject to inspection. In addition, FDA continued to inspect relatively few foreign establishments, and when it did, investigators faced challenges that influenced how the inspections were conducted. For example, unlike in the US, where an establishment has no notice that an investigator is coming, FDA routinely gave manufacturers significant notice. And FDA investigators relied on English-speaking employees of the establishment that they were inspecting to translate key documents, including those demonstrating compliance with good manufacturing practices. In 2010, we found that while FDA was conducting more inspections overseas, many establishments still had never been inspected. We also identified shortcomings in the operations of foreign offices FDA opened to provide the agency with in-country information and inspection capability. In 2010 and 2016, we found that these offices faced persistently high vacancy rates, raising questions about their effectiveness. As a result of these and other challenges, we added FDA's oversight of medical products to GAO's high-risk list. Last December, we reported that from 2012 to 2016, FDA increased the number of foreign inspections it conducted. And in 2015, FDA had, for the first time, conducted more foreign inspections than domestic. A growing percentage of these were in China and India, which have the largest number of establishments manufacturing drugs for the United States. However, as Senator Grassley noted, we also found that FDA still provided up to 3 months advance notice to most foreign inspections, which could give establishments a chance to fix the problem before an investigator even arrives. Investigators also continued to face persistent challenges when they traveled overseas. As we learned on our site visit to India and China and in conversation with investigators, A single investigator often had to inspect manufacturing campuses covering hundreds of acres of land in rural areas. Most had little flexibility to extend their time at a facility because travel schedules required back-to-back inspections. FDA also continued to send inspectors into establishment without translators. We were told this was particularly difficult in Japan and China. Investigators also had to rely on translators provided by the same drug manufacturer that they're inspecting, raising questions about the accuracy of the information. One investigator told us they had to resort to a translation app on their phone. We also found that from 2016 to 2018, both foreign and domestic inspections had decreased. FDA attributed the decline in part to continued vacancies among investigators available to conduct these investigations. While FDA has made strides over the years, these persistent challenges raise questions about its ability to conduct inspections overseas that are equivalent to those done here in the United States. The pandemic has further complicated the playing field. In March, as has already been noted, the agency announced it had postponed nearly all inspections of foreign manufacturing establishments. While FDA notes that it has other tools to ensure the safety of the U.S. drug supply, the lack of foreign inspections removes a critical source of information about the quality of the drugs that are manufactured for our U.S. market. Further, it is unclear the effect COVID will have on FDA's ability to fill those persistent vacancies, both in foreign offices and among the U.S.-based inspectors who conduct most of the inspections overseas. And it is unclear the effect on FDA's ability to gather that critical in-country information to help determine, for example, which establishments are at higher risk. Thank you, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee for holding this hearing. I conclude my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I see one of your credentials, Mary, is having taught at Sam Houston State University. So it's good to have you as a witness here today.
Thank you.
Dr. Throckmorton will be the next witness, Deputy Director of Regulatory Programs for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Dr. Throckmorton.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee, I am Dr. Douglas Throckmorton, Deputy Director of Regulatory Programs at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in the FDA. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Protecting the safety, quality, and availability of medicines for Americans is at the heart of everything we do at the FDA. To accomplish this, we use several tools. Today's hearing is focused on inspections, which are one important part of a robust and multi-pronged approach to overseeing safety and quality of FDA-regulated products. While important, inspections are not the only impetus for drug quality. First and foremost, the firms manufacturing these products have the primary responsibility to reliably produce quality products. Sponsors are required to comply with good manufacturing practices to assure the identity, strength, and purity of their products, and to provide routine quality testing. CDER and FDA supports this work by providing guidance to them about best manufacturing practices, critically assessing adverse events to spot manufacturing issues, actively surveilling drug quality, and applying post-marketing study requirements to identify and evaluate emerging drug safety signals. The goal of all of these efforts is to protect the public health. We also partner with the FDA's ORA to maximize the values of inspections. Additionally, other safety initiatives include proactive testing by FDA of selected pharmaceutical ingredients and finished dosage form drugs in our state-of-the-art laboratories. Only a small percentage, about 1% of drugs that are tested, fail to meet the established quality specifications. Additionally, the manufacturing quality problems we do identify are similar for both U.S. and foreign facilities. We also collect data about safety of the quality of the drugs once they are on the market. And just this week, CDER released our 5th annual report entitled Drug Safety Priorities 2019, detailing our key safety programs and activities and highlighting the depth and versatility of our drug safety initiatives across CDER. All these checks and rechecks are needed because much of pharmaceutical manufacturing still operates with decades-old approaches and technologies. CDER's vision is to spur the industry to modernize so the quality can be consistently and reliably built into each tablet or vial they produce. This includes initiatives to encourage advanced manufacturing technologies and quality management maturity. While time does not permit me to go into detail, I would welcome the opportunity to discuss these proactive strategies. CDER believes they would yield important benefits for drug quality and safety. Importantly, these advanced manufacturing techniques can provide a safer and more secure drug supply chain and may promote a shift to a more U.S. domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. I look forward to working with the committee to protect the reliability and availability of drugs to treat Americans and to strengthen investments in modern manufacturing technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Throckmorton. We'll now go to rounds of questioning, and the chairman's gone to vote, so he's asked me to chair in his absence. I would like to maybe change the topic just slightly, but if it seems to me there's one thing that COVID-19 has taught us, it's we can't rely on supply chains coming from outside of our country. We've long become accustomed to being able to buy cheaper products because they're manufactured in other countries with the lower overhead, labor, and other costs. But obviously this pandemic has demonstrated, at least to me, the importance of onshoring a lot of our most basic functions, things like medical equipment, things like drugs. And I'd just like to get the reaction of the witnesses to, am I wrong? Or do you think we're stuck with this dispersed global supply chain that can be disrupted in the next pandemic? Or do you think there's steps as a matter of sound public policy that Congress ought to consider in terms of bringing that capacity for manufacturing back on shore? So, Ms. McMeekin, would you care to take a stab at that?
First, sure, thank you. American consumers should know that the U.S. drug supply is safe and supply chains are secure. The U.S. drug supply is among the safest in the world. FDA thoroughly reviews drug applications to ensure that medications are safe and effective before they reach the market and oversee drug quality post-approval.
Excuse me just a second. Did you say our supply chains are secure?
Yes.
How much of our active pharmaceutical ingredients for our drugs in America depend on China?
I'm going to refer to Doug. Doug, can you add to the...
And how much do we depend on India for the base?
The number that I have.
Pardon me?
Go ahead, Doug.
Dr. Throckmorton, go ahead. I'm sorry.
For active pharmaceuticals, active pharmaceutical ingredients, the U.S. provides about 28%, China about 13%, and India 18%.
So, I mean, they're as secure as the supply from China and from India is, at least for the percentage that they contribute. But I seem to remember that there was at least one instance during the pandemic where hydroxychloroquine was being hoarded by one of our countries that ordinarily is the source for that drug. Did I remember that incorrectly, or do you recall that?
We do have imports of products, and FDA uses additional tools to help complement our inspections, including remote assessments of foreign manufacturing firms.
I'm sorry, I'm not talking about inspections now. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I'm just talking about in the midst of the next pandemic, what percentage of the pharmaceuticals, the active pharmaceutical ingredients that we depend upon in the United States are vulnerable or in jeopardy because that supply chain that supply comes from a country, let's say in this instance where China obviously has been the main source of personal protective equipment, but after the virus broke out, they obviously delayed notifying the World Health Organization and other countries around the world why they hoarded personal protective equipment. It seems to me the same thing could happen to our drug supply. Am I wrong?
The foreign establishments and domestic establishments are held to the same standards. The standards are the same whether you're foreign or you're domestic. We follow the same process to inspect them. We have the same standards to inspect them, and they are held to the same high standards of FDA requirements.
So the percentage of active pharmaceutical ingredient that we get from China, if for some reason China is either unwilling or unable to continue supplying that, doesn't that strike you as a vulnerability for the United States and our public health?
It would be good to have redundant systems.
Okay. Any of you care to venture what it is that the United States Congress might do as a matter of sound public policy to encourage more manufacturing of active pharmaceutical ingredients here in the United States as opposed to depending on these supply chains overseas?
Senator, I might take a stab at that one, and I'll just echo what you said. We do need a robust and reliable supply source for all of our drugs for the American public. No question at all. We do believe that there are things that we can do as a country that would encourage additional onshoring. As I mentioned in my testimony, we believe that the advanced manufacturing practices that U.S. firms currently employ put us ahead of what's seen in the rest of the world, and that to the extent we could encourage and support the adoption of those, it would reduce costs. We believe it would reduce environmental impact by reducing size of factories. It could potentially improve the security by reducing the length of the supply chain. And we believe there would be a good business case potentially for drug firms to make the decision to onshore those factories and bring them back to the U.S. with the net result that we would see the additional redundancy and increased security that you're rightly asking how to incentivize.
Thank you, Dr. Throckmorton. This is beyond the scope of really what this hearing is, but I couldn't pass the opportunity to ask you those questions. I appreciate your answer, and I trust that at some point the Finance Committee and the Senate and the Congress as a whole will take up how do we reduce our vulnerability to supply chains that we've seen is a risk to our public health and our ability to deal with risks like this pandemic for the benefit of the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you very much for taking over while I voted. I'm going to start with Dr. Meakin. The Government Accountability Office has noted that almost all domestic inspections are unannounced. However, the FDA often pre-announces foreign inspections. In some cases, FDA has provided 12 weeks of notice before a foreign inspection. Question number one, by providing advance warning, doesn't it give bad actors time to hide the true nature of the problems at their facilities?
So in general, domestic drug surveillance inspections are almost always unannounced, whereas foreign establishments generally receive advance notice of the surveillance inspections. Given the importance of avoiding a potential refusal and waste of ORE resources, most foreign inspections are pre-announced, and this pre-announcement is intended to verify that the facility is indeed a drug manufacturer with a jurisdiction under the FDA, to facilitate the inspection process and ensure appropriate records and personnel will be made available. We also announced foreign inspections due to the jurisdictional differences between domestic and foreign firms. The pre-announcement process documents the foreign firm's agreement to allow FDA to inspect. When a foreign firm refuses an inspection, FDA takes a different course of action than with a domestic refusal. In the domestic arena, FDA can seek an inspection warrant to enter the facility. However, in the foreign arena, due to the jurisdictional differences, FDA can refuse products at the border or not grant an approval, but FDA does not have the authority to compel the firm to allow FDA to enter and inspect. In mid-2019, we did initiate a change to our IT system to accurately record data of whether an inspection was announced or unannounced. Efforts are underway to include a data field in our inspectional database in the next version scheduled for this June to accurately record whether an inspection is announced or unannounced. Having this accurate data will enable a critical evaluation of the outcome of inspections. Although typically domestic sites are not announced and foreign are typically unannounced, we do conduct for-cause inspections in the foreign arena.
I want all three people FDA to answer this one. Do any of you know why the Obama administration shut down the India pilot program?
Thank you, Senator Grassley, for that question. The India pilot was not a true pilot. It was rolled out only in one country. It had no metrics by which we could evaluate whether it was a success or not. And it was collecting data with inherent bias in that we perform unannounced inspections abroad on a for-cause basis, meaning that FDA had already determined those firms had significant problems. We did, however, implement some best practices that we determined were useful from the pilot program. First, we stopped having firms issue letters so that we could get visas for our investigators. Second, we stopped having firms make our hotel selections for us. And third, and probably most importantly, we began a program whereby the investigator going out on the inspection received a pre-approval briefing from his colleagues or her colleagues at ORA headquarters to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the inspection.
I ask all three of you to respond to that, but because of time, I want to ask Dr. Denegan Macaulay, would unannounced foreign inspections improve FDA's ability to oversee the drug supply chain, and if not, why not?
We do feel that unannounced inspections are very important, and as was noted, some are done, but they are in very few, and it does raise questions about the equivalency to what we do here in the United States.
And also to you, should FDA gain visibility into the active pharmaceutical suppliers for final dosage form facilities, would that better help FDA oversee the supply chain, and if not, why not?
So understanding the supply chain for the active pharmaceutical ingredient is very important. It is challenging. It is quite complex. The ingredients can come from many different sources, and being able to enhance that oversight and visibility into that supply chain would be something that would be very valuable for understanding the safety of the drug.
Okay, my time's up, so I'm Senator Wyden.
Let me start with you, Ms. Denegan Macaulay, on March 28th of this year. So this is on the Trump administration's watch. The FDA issued an emergency use authorization allowing the acceptance and use of 2 malaria drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 through the stockpile. One source for these drugs, which the FDA specifically allowed into the United States, were manufacturing plants in Pakistan. Rick Bright, the HHS whistleblower, reported these plants had never been inspected by the FDA. Another source of the malaria drugs specifically allowed into the United States by the FDA is an Indian company, which is on the FDA import alert list and which has been prohibited by the FDA from bringing these exact drugs to the United States since 2015. These are drugs that have long been known to carry cardiac health risks. There wasn't any solid medical evidence that they were effective in the treatment of COVID-19. My first question to you, Ms. Denigan-McCauley, is it dangerous to Americans to import and distribute drugs from India that up until a few days ago could not come into our country because they were on the import alert list? I would hope we could get a yes or no answer to that question.
Yes, we would have concerns and hope that it's science-based decision.
Okay. Is it dangerous to Americans to import and distribute drugs from facilities in Pakistan that have never been inspected? Again, a yes or no, please.
Yes, dangerous from any country not inspected.
All right. Now, Dr. Rick Bright, the former head of BARDA until he was fired by the Trump administration, is now a whistleblower and has said that FDA's process for approving the drugs was not based on science. It was based on politics. So let me ask you, because we're not going to get you into politics here, is that how the process is supposed to work? What I've described, is that the way things are supposed to traditionally play out so as to protect the public's interest?
It should be based on science.
No, but I just described to you the process. Is the process that I described the way things are supposed to work?
We haven't looked extensively into that, and we have ongoing work looking at emergency use authorizations, and we'd be happy to address that issue once we've looked carefully to ensure that that was the process used.
So you are going to look at whether this process I've described sounds like the traditional process that's based on science, because Rick Bright, the whistleblower, has said this does not resemble science. And I just asked you about whether these processes were dangerous. You told me yes. So it's kind of hard to see how something that's dangerous, by your words, is somehow in line with the process, but we will wait and see about your follow-up inquiry. Now, one of the problems created by efforts by the president to talk up the dubious nature of these malaria drugs is that it has created shortages of the drugs for Americans who rely on them for illnesses unrelated to COVID-19, like lupus. How can those Americans be sure that the drugs they depend on are safe when drugs that we know aren't inspected by the FDA aren't coming into the country?
So there's no country of origin labeling. So as a consumer, you wouldn't know if that came from Pakistan or from an inspected facility, an uninspected or inspected.
Okay, so that is yet another factor in raising concern about how all these practices that we're talking about from March and succeeding weeks on the Trump administration's watch represent real danger. And I appreciate your laying. Frankly, I've already gone through it with the tough change. You got to have the person here who can actually change. Horribly short of medical supplies. The search for N95 respirators and PPE has been a nightmare for my state for weeks. After Oregon bought respirators that the FDA has authorized for import for China under an emergency use authorization, the FDA then removed them from the approved list. At the same time, companies in Oregon that have been trying to get EUA approval to make respirators have been unable to do so. How does it make sense that manufacturers of substandard equipment from China get an FDA emergency okay to ship to America, and manufacturers in the United States and my state who want to make those same products get put on hold? How does that make sense?
I don't have an answer for you. FDA does have oversight over these medical devices, and I don't have an answer. It's a decision that FDA alone makes with that authority and in coordination with the task force, so FEMA and DOD with the support of FDA.
Well, I just hope we can get that changed, because to me it defies common sense. Emergency authorization, and the United States cannot get a call returned. That means something is really out of whack. And again, the person who's accountable for changing the kinds of problems we've outlined isn't here. And that's why I felt so strongly about making it clear we think we're not going to get to the bottom of it until we hear from him. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next person on a first-come, first-served basis would be Mr. Toomey. I'll wait a couple seconds. Is he available?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to go back to the line of questioning that Senator Cornyn was pursuing. Dr. Throckmorton, back in March, the FDA commissioner identified 20 drugs out of the over 20,000 drugs that are available in the United States. 20 he identified as being solely made in China or containing an API that was solely sourced from China. Further, I believe that in this report, it was determined that none of these drugs were considered critical drugs, and I think the criteria for being critical is a drug for which there is no available substitute. So first of all, is that your understanding of the extent of dependence on China as a source of drugs and API? Because certainly that makes it sound as though there's not a great deal of reliance on Chinese sources for critical drugs.
Senator, let me answer your question by going back to where we found ourselves in March and the situation we needed to respond to. So as we typically respond to an increase in needs for drug, we see drug shortages occur. When drug shortages occur, I have a staff whose sole job 24/7 is to reach out to manufacturers, look at API manufacturers, identify possible sources for those products. So if we go back to March, what we found ourselves in was a situation where we were looking to identify the products that were essential and which products were not as essential for the immediate response to COVID. That drug shortage team, along with work in other offices, went to work looking at the available products. Where were they made? What products were available? And the short answer to your question is yes, you're right. China had a small footprint as far as the creation of manufacturing of those drugs. Having said that,
can I just want a clarification here, Doctor? Are you saying that this report, these 20 drugs, that these are just within the universe of drugs that are for the purpose of treating COVID-19, or is it more broad? Is it broader than that?
Great question, and I apologize if I wasn't clear. Definitely broader than that. And again, it starts with where we found ourselves in March. We knew less than we do now about the impact of COVID. We knew much less than we know about now about the specific drugs that are needed. And so our focus was on products that we knew were historically in shortage, products that we anticipated would likely to be needed in hospitals. As we learned more, we needed to we responded and evolved.
Yeah, my question is focusing much more broadly than just on COVID-19. I want to understand the American public has an understandable concern about whether or not and to what extent we could be reliant on any one country, and most of all, a adversarial country, on something as important as life-saving medicines. But it sounds to me like from this March report, the FDA's conclusion is that there are no drugs that are considered critical drugs, in other words, drugs for which there is no substitute, on which we rely on China, and less than 0.1% of all drugs are sole sourced from China or contain an API that is solely sourced from China. So do I have the basic facts correct?
Well, I want to get back with you. I'll have to get back with you about the basic facts. I don't want to mislead you about that. But I do want to agree with your focus on the larger issue of total availability. Whether a product comes from a specific country or not is important. I'm not minimizing that, but it's more important for me as a U.S. federal drug official to make sure the drug is available from somewhere to meet the needs of the American public. So if it's China or it's France or it's whatever, it is of interest, but I'm even more interested in knowing the total available market. Can it meet the needs of the U.S. or not? Right. If it can, and it's done to high quality, then that's the piece I'm going to want to stay focused on.
So we had certainly in my state of Pennsylvania, we heard from healthcare providers, hospitals, and pharmacies about shortages of drugs that they wanted to be able to administer, and much of which was related to COVID treatment. It was pain medicine, it was antibiotics, it was inhalers, it was a variety of medicines, and there were shortages. So could you characterize the source of that? Is it just because there was a sudden spike in demand because suddenly we had a lot of people with COVID-19? Or were there other factors contributing to these shortages?
So that's a terrific question. Short answer, we don't know all of the factors that led to that, whether it's distribution challenges with particular hospitals or whether it was solely related to isolated demand in particular areas. There were a variety of different factors that drove spot shortages that were extremely serious. So where I started before was to say we focused on the larger market, and that has been our historic goal. With COVID, we had to start worrying about your hospitals in Pennsylvania.
And just my last, I'm probably out of time. Just the last quick final question. Are you aware of any case where a source of these medicines from overseas, the country or the manufacturer overseas decided not, for whatever reason, not to distribute to the United States medicines that they normally would have? And was there a conscious decision to withhold medicines that American consumers needed?
I'm not aware of any case where the country carried through on that threat to withhold medicines, no.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Senator Stabenow. Okay, then we'll go. Go ahead, Senator Stabenow.
I'm here. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Wyden. And I certainly agree that the FDA should increase inspections to make sure that drugs we rely on are safe and effective. I do think it's important to note that in the current budget that the Trump administration budget for 2021 actually froze the number of field staff for human drug and biologic safety programs, which is a great concern when that was proposed, and they actually called for budget cuts. So we certainly need to make sure we're not doing that. This is obviously an important topic in a moment, though, where we are looking at over 100,000 people having lost their lives in the United States because of COVID-19, over 5,000 people in Michigan alone. And we have an urgent need to address this major healthcare pandemic and be very much focused on it. And now, on top of everything else, we have another huge urgent issue, which is what is happening in terms of African Americans in this country, and not only racial disparities on display because of COVID-19, but also what are as a result of the horrific murder of George Floyd. Violence like this against African Americans has gone on too often and for way too long, and it's all interconnected. The reality is racism is a human rights issue, but it's also a health issue. And as I said, it's playing out in COVID-19, where 14% of our Michiganders are African American, yet over 40% of the deaths are African Americans because of health disparities. So this is a huge issue. So we've all got to come together and bring accountability and change and healing to the country, and I hope we will do that. My colleagues have talked a couple of times about what we need to do in terms of bringing pharmaceutical drugs, bringing needed medicine back to the United States. I couldn't agree more that we need to do that. I do want to point out, though, that in the tax cut that was passed by Republicans in 2017, there were, of course, trillions of dollars in cuts, billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical industry, but nothing that incentivized or required the companies either to lower the cost of prescription drugs or to bring the jobs back and the medicines back to the United States. In fact, the structure of the global minimum tax, the GILTI tax provision, exempts the first 10% of income from physical assets, factories and so on, in foreign countries, which creates an incentive to offshore physical assets to increase the exemption. So we could start by getting rid of that and then focus on what we need to do here in the United States. Let me speak and ask questions related to specifically the FDA, where I have great concern, and I know that people in Michigan do, about the politics that has been interjected into the FDA. We need the FDA to be based on science, to be making decisions that are in the best interest of all of us, our safety, the right thing to do based on science. We all know now about the president's talking and now in his saying he took the hydroxychloroquine, and in fact, the FDA provided an emergency use authorization for the drug on March 28th, and then now on your website, you indicate that there's no evidence the drug treats COVID-19 and in fact could actually cause loss of life. But the emergency use authorization waived the current good manufacturing practices that you've talked about today, allowing the drugs to be imported from uninspected foreign manufacturing facilities. Is that correct? Just yes or no is fine.
I pass that to my colleague, Dr. McMeekin.
FDA has inspected manufacturers of hydroxychloroquine, and as recently as of April of 2020, an inspection of an alternate manufacturer of hydroxychloroquine was actually conducted by our India Global Office.
Did you share the concerns of Rick Bright, who was talking about the safety issues around this? You and your colleagues, the whole question of the safety around this particular drug?
Can you give a short answer to that so we can go on to the next witness or next member?
I have not had those discussions. Dr. Throckmorton.
Okay.
But let me just say, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize I'm out of time, but I would just say that people are deeply, deeply concerned. We want to be able to trust the integrity of the FDA, and with the politics and things that have been happening, it's deeply concerning.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Sass is next. Okay, then Senator Cantwell. Okay, then Senator Menendez. Okay, Senator Carper.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, just a minute. Go ahead, Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Trump announced last Friday that the United States would terminate its relationship with the World Health Organization by terminating our relationship with the world's premier global Health Organization, the administration is advocating, in my view, U.S. long-held leadership role on health on the world stage, a role that China will be eager to fill. This decision also undermines the safety of Americans. We know that if we don't work in partnership with the WHO and the international community to combat COVID-19 everywhere, all Americans will remain at risk. So, Mr. Abdou, beyond its urgent work on COVID-19, WHO is also the central entity to the fight against other major health threats that matter to Americans. The bulk of U.S. funds to WHO help save lives, gives hope to populations around the world facing diseases like polio, malaria, measles, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, including in humanitarian hotspots like Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where agencies and NGOs are unwilling to work. How does the administration intend to address this needs? What's the plan?
Thank you for that question, Senator Menendez. I am not familiar with those discussions and would refer you to the National Security Council or the presidential spokesperson.
You have no idea on these issues relating to the World Health Organization?
As I said, I've not been privy to those conversations.
Pretty amazing. Dr. Throckmorton, on April 8th, I sent a letter with Representative Pascrell to Dr. Hahn to express concerns about the FDA's emergency use authorization approval process during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular, the fast tracking of approvals for potential treatments promoted by various administration officials, including the president. The FDA is the gold standard worldwide for drug and device approval, and I believe it's important to ensure that nothing, especially pressure from the White House, erodes that public trust in the FDA. Can you confirm for the committee that the FDA did not change its protocols for EUA approvals during this pandemic and specific to approvals for hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine?
Senator, I was not privy to all of the discussions that led up to the EUA authorizations. I can tell you I'm aware of no instance of political influence on any of the decision making.
But the question is, did the FDA, can you confirm that the FDA did not change its protocols for EUA approvals during the pandemic?
The approach, as far as I am aware, was the same as the approach that we have taken in past emergency use authorizations.
Well, then explain to the committee, how is it that the FDA issued emergency approval of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine to treat COVID-19 despite the fact that there was no adequate and well-controlled trial demonstrating safety and efficacy for COVID-19 patients?
I think what I'd want to do is refer you to the materials that are available on our website that lay out in general ways the types of information that we had at the time that we approved the emergency use authorization. There were data available, and a decision was made at that period of time that it supported the emergency use authorization. I should say we continue to collect additional information, continue to reevaluate as additional data come available. That led to the drug safety communication, for instance.
If you want to refer me to documents, I don't need to have a hearing. I have you at a hearing. At the end of the day, there was former FDA officials questioned the EUA, noting the lack of scientific evidence. And sure enough, researchers are raising concerns about hydroxychloroquine. Just this week, the WHO halted its trial of hydroxychloroquine due to harmful side effects, including heart problems. So, we should have Commissioner Hahn then come to explain this discrepancy. Dr. Degnan-McCauley, given that we're likely to see additional global spikes in cases during the pandemic, what specific steps should the FDA take to ensure continued oversight of foreign manufacturers and also ensure the safety of their inspectors?
Thank you. Yeah, it is important that the inspectors have their safety taken into consideration, so I can certainly understand what FDA is doing in that end. It is important, though, that decisions be made on science and that they continue to get the critical information that they need to know what establishments may be at risk. And so, for example, with the EUA, the emergency use authorization, we do have work that we're beginning that is going to look at that and look at the decision making and look to see if any criteria had changed. We've previously reported that you need to maintain good criteria when you take a drastic step like that, allowing an importer who's banned to be able to have a drug like hydroxychloroquine come into the United States. So they need to be diligent, and while we're in an emergency, they still need to be very careful moving quickly during this unprecedented time to ensure that they follow the steps that they have put in place for the safety of our drugs.
Is Senator Sass ready? Is Senator Cantwell ready? Okay, Senator Carper.
Senator Carper is ready.
Yeah, he sure
Chairman,
is.
thank you for the hearing, to you and Senator Wyden, our ranking member, to our witnesses, especially the one who I think was an undergraduate at the University of Delaware and studied animal science a few years ago. We're happy to welcome, especially welcome Mary Dennigan McCauley, and would ask you pass on to Jean Dodaro and your colleagues at GAO our sincere appreciation for the work that you do every day for our country.
Thank you.
Go ahead. You're welcome, but we thank you. Before I ask a question or two of our witnesses, I want to just make some brief comments. Racial disparities in this country of ours are rampant, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated some of those issues, as we know. People of color are less likely to work a job that will allow them to work from home. In addition to having increased exposure to the virus, people of color tend to have lower access to health insurance, to healthy foods, and economic opportunities, increasing their likelihood of a pre-existing condition. These issues, paired with many other socioeconomic inequities, make people of color disproportionately more likely to contract COVID-19 and die from it. Nearly 23% of the over 100,000 COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. are African American, while they only make up about 13% of the American population. Hispanics and Latinos make up 4% of the U.S. population, but made up 11% of cases. And with the recent killing of George Floyd at the hands of police officers, we are seeing yet again another form of devastating effect on communities of color, and particularly Black Americans. Americans across the country are feeling deep pain and devastation, and they are grieving the loss of loved ones to COVID-19 and the loss of George Floyd. We can do better than this, and we must do better than this. First question I have is for you, Mary, and I would ask, does GAO, that's kind of a two-part question, does GAO have any work examining racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare that would speak to important issues to consider in light of the response to COVID-19? That's my first question.
We do. We have work that we will begin looking at the disparities for COVID specifically for the reasons that you mentioned, and that'll be very important to see the results of that work. We also have past work. And so, for example, we issued a report recently, I believe it was in April of this year, on maternity mortality. And you see the same disparities there that we're seeing here with Native Alaskans and Hispanics and Black women dying more frequently of maternal mortality related deaths than with other in the United States. And so it is very concerning. And it's important too that as we go forward with COVID, that we look not only at the data, but then how we're collecting it, and that we look at how we're reporting it. Because one of the findings that we had with our maternal mortality was that the data that was being collected was very difficult to get at real-time data and to get it out there in time to make it useful for the researchers. Sometimes it lagged as much as 3 years. And during this pandemic right now, we need data more quickly than that. So hopefully CDC, I'm sure, is taking that into consideration for lessons learned going forward with COVID.
Thank you for that response. Let me ask a follow-up question. Does GAO have any work examining the collection of health care data that raises issues important to the COVID-19 response beyond what you just said?
Yeah, well, I think number one is ensuring that that data can be collected in a way that can be collated, and ensuring that the states are doing it equally. As you know, the data is collected at a local level and then it's rolled up. And so that would be very important. Our past work has shown that it needs to be collected in a way that it can be standardized and equal across all of the states.
Thank you. And a question to be shared by Dr. McMeekin and Dr. Throckmorton. Where are you and your colleagues, or what are you and your colleagues doing to ensure that the rules of the road for COVID-19 test and PPE manufacturers are clear, they're consistent, they're stable enough to ensure that we as a country can produce and procure a sufficient and high quality supply of tests and PPE? Dr. McMeekin?
Sure. So we would continue to continue with our tools to help as these products are imported in. We have additional tools to complement the inspections, including we utilize an import screening tool called Predict, where we can adjust based upon different concerns or of specific products. We also do conduct physical examinations in product sampling. So we'll continue that effort.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Throckmorton, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add. The devices are regulated in a different center. Our major interaction has been around the shortage groups. We've been trying to share whatever shortage information we could obtain with that group around PPE to make sure they had that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, there's a fellow named Charles Throckmorton, who's a Marine, National Air Force lieutenant colonel now, who was on an attaché in our office for a year or two. And he just, he went off back to Dover Air Force Base doing great work for our country. And I just want to say he reflects well on the Throckmorton family.
God bless you. Before I call on the next senator, without objection, I want to put in the record letters of oversight that I sent to HHS, FDA regarding their foreign inspection regime on August the 6th. Those letters were sent on June the 27th, 2019. And on August the 6th, 2019, I sent a second oversight letters to HHS and FDA. We received responses to both, including thousands of pages of records, and these records will be inserted in the record without objection. Now I'll go back to, is Sass or Cantwell ready? Okay, then is Senator Cardin ready?
I'm here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Go ahead. You're in the room.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank all of our witnesses.
I'm sorry.
I want to ask the question to Dr. Throckmorton as it relates to the supply chain issue and the shortages of drugs. We recognize that COVID-19 makes life more challenging in regards to the supply chain. And we want to make sure that our supply chain is safe. We also want to make sure that to the extent possible we have domestic supplies, that we don't have that risk factor. But before COVID-19, we have found drug shortages in the United States, not because of foreign source, but because it just wasn't as profitable for drug companies to manufacture particular drugs than other drugs. And in some cases, it was a single U.S. source for those drugs. And I'm talking about important drugs, dealing with infant safety, dealing with cancer maintenance treatments, dealing with diabetes, that we had a shortage in the domestic supply because of the economics involved. Now, we've introduced some bills to try to do something about it, but does the FDA have a strategy to make sure that we don't have drug shortages in this country, even when there is adequate supply chain issues, but it's more the economics of a private drug manufacturer deciding not to make enough of that drug available to the population?
Senator Cardin, you raise an incredibly important point. COVID basically superimposes new demands on the drug supply on top of existing drug shortage demands, doesn't it? So we started with a situation where we were challenged for many critically important drugs. and then COVID hit us. And now we have a sort of additional challenge. Yes, I believe there are things that we could do to address the economic disincentives that are leading to choices made by manufacturers either to leave the market or to seek less expensive places for manufacturing. We put out a drug shortage report, as I know you're aware, last fall, and it laid out some of the solutions that we believe are important. One critically important one I'm very fond of that I talk about now is the quality management maturity. The idea that if we could find a way to improve the transparency about the quality of the drug supply chain, purchasers could make better choices about what products to choose to pay just a little bit more for, to be assured that they were high quality. Quality management maturity, we believe, would help lead the way to get that kind of transparency by, at least in part, giving us the ability to set up a rating system to identify products that were manufactured to very high quality, higher than just meeting the minimum standards, and to allow manufacturers to advertise that they've received that rating, with the hope that then they would be paid just that little extra more, so that they could make the choice to manufacture the product instead of the choice to leave the market. As you point out, prices for many of generic critical drugs continue to fall, despite their being difficult to obtain. And we need to find a way to change that economic incentive if we can.
I appreciate that answer, and I'm all for providing financial incentives so that less expensive drugs don't go into drug shortage. Count me as a supporter of that. We've been talking about some of these drugs now for a couple years, and they're still in shortage. It seems to me we may have to look for an additional supplier of that drug in addition to the drug company that currently manufactures that product. So I hope that we would look at broader ways, because allowing these shortages to continue in the wealthiest nation in the world like us is just ridiculous when there is no supply issue. It's just a price incentive to the manufacturer of the drug. We should be able to overcome that together. And I would hope that you would work with us and let us figure out a way to bring this to an end.
I'd be delighted to do anything that I can, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. And now I'm going to go back to the top of the list, Ms. Cantwell, Senator Cantwell, and if she's not answering, Senator Brown would be next. Okay, then we'll go to Senator Case.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Brown's here. I was being polite, Mr. Chairman, and waiting for Senator Cantwell.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you. And I'm sorry to cut in front of my friend Bob Casey, but oh well. Dr. Throckmorton, does the FDA have the authority to require a mandatory recall of a prescription drug? It seems to me that mandatory recall authority could help expedite FDA ability to pull an adulterated product or harmful drug from the market. Do you agree?
Senator, we don't have mandatory recall authority. Having said that, the vast majority of the time when we do request a recall by a company, they do in fact do it. It's only the rare case where people have pushed back against the need for that recall. But okay, we would be happy to talk with you about.
Okay, we would like to pursue that. And we'll follow up with Congressional Affairs at FDA because we would like to work on that with you. I want to raise one other issue and then a brief statement. Raise the issue of active pharmaceutical ingredients. Last year in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Dr. Woodcock testified there's a gap in FDA authority as it relates to APIs and reporting requirements when it comes to over-the-counter medications. Dr. Throckmorton, can you speak a little more about these gaps, why they're problematic, and if the FDA is interested in working with Congress in filling this gap in authority?
I'm happy to talk in general terms about those gaps. I'll begin by saying I think we're in very similar circumstances to where we were when Dr. Woodcock testified. So I believe the same issues still exist, which is that for those kinds of products, those APIs used for compounding and certain over-the-counter products, they can be given to Americans without inspections being required by the manufacturers. Now, we do sometimes inspect those facilities, as you know. There are other ways for us to do that, but there is no requirement for it, and we think that is a loophole. Dr. Woodcock called it a loophole. We'd be happy to work with you on that.
Okay, we will pursue that. I'm Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Wyden. I try not to indulge too often in the Senate's penchant for grandstanding. I try to work with colleagues in both parties, bringing substantive questions, especially to this committee. But I'm astounded by the topic of this hearing. Our country is in crisis. People are dying of a disease that continues to spread, particularly among seniors, particularly among Black and brown workers who are keeping our society afloat, the essential workers that are frankly expendable. They're not paid well. They're not protected in the workplace. Black Americans continue to die at the hands of the very people who are supposed to protect them. The president refuses to lead. My Senate Republican colleagues refuse to stand up and speak out about it. We should be the people to fill that presidential void. I share this chairman's concern over the weaknesses in our drug supply chain, but we serve in the most powerful committee in the Senate. This is the Finance Committee's first hearing since the onset of the pandemic and since the murders of Mr. Floyd and Ms. Taylor. And as I said this morning in our Banking Committee hearing, not everything's about money, but that's what this committee has power over, and it can make a whole lot of difference to a whole lot. We have power over unemployment insurance, taxes, the programs like Health, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, the Affordable Care Act. We ought to be using that power to help the people who make the country work and to show Americans, all Americans, including our Black and brown sisters and brothers, that their government's actually on their side. We could be putting more money directly in those Americans' pockets instead of trusting that it will trickle down through corporations, because, Mr. Chairman, I know Senator Wyden knows this, I think you do, Mr. Chairman, that it doesn't trickle down. We could be discussing safety standards for nursing homes. 30,000 seniors have lost their lives to this illness. Thousands of workers, largely women, many people of color, are putting their own health care at risk for our loved ones.
Inspection overseas. And when it comes to everything else you mentioned about COVID, this committee has done several things by increasing reimbursement for Medicaid connected with COVID-19 by 20%, more money for Medicaid. We have put $175 million into hospitals as a result of it. We've given out $300 billion in increased unemployment. We have reduced payroll taxes for 1 year for companies that liquidity. We have set up a program for increased liquidity for other companies as well besides small business. And this committee's been very active in the $3 trillion that's already out for the pandemic and the shutdown of the economy and the opening up of the economy as a result of government shutting it down. So I think this committee has been very active in everything related to the pandemic and will be more active when, as we decided 7 weeks ago, that whatever decisions we were making 7 weeks ago, we did not know if the economy would turn around. We would not know the condition of the pandemic. And we went into it with open eyes that if there's more needed to be done, that we would do it. And we're in the middle of that process now. And when we get to the point of making that add-on decisions, whatever needs to be done, this committee will be active at that particular time. But with tens of millions of dollars in the CARES Act 1, that is still not out. Our work in the first step is not done yet. I will...
Mr. Chairman, if I could take the last part of my time. Lincoln used to tell his White House staff, I got to go out and get my public opinion baths. And I think if any of us are on the phone, I know a lot of us are on the phone a lot of the time, and we still see the pain and the suffering. And I see my colleagues from New Hampshire, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. I know how hard they work and how they're hearing about that pain and suffering. And this committee has got to be talking about extending the unemployment benefits and got to be talking about health care and Medicaid, and having no hearings for the last, 7 or 8 or 10 weeks when there is so much suffering out there and so much work to be done. But I'll stop there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I know you're the person that always wants the last word, and so to get on with this hearing, I'll let you get away with what you always get away with. Mr. Casey, Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for this hearing. I want to note that these issues that relate to the FDA are very important, but I don't think we can forget at this time in our nation's history, especially this week after what happened just a week ago, I don't think we can fail to remember the murder of George Floyd and all the pain, the trauma, the anger, and the protests that have resulted from that death. We can't simply condemn the actions that killed him and lament the failures of our criminal justice system as it relates to the African American community. We should do both, but that's not enough. We must act legislatively. This committee doesn't have the same jurisdiction as the Judiciary Committee, but it does. This committee, the Finance Committee, does have jurisdiction over healthcare and economic security, for example. And there's a lot we could do to examine a whole range of issues under those broad topics that relate to communities of color. And part of our set of actions to help these communities must focus on those actions. Second, I would note that in the broad category of COVID-19, the deaths that have resulted in the number of cases, the death number is disproportionately higher for African Americans. In some states, it's more than double or triple the percent of the population. The percent of the deaths are outpacing by a long shot the percent of the population. As it relates to what this committee could be doing in connection to COVID-19, one of the areas that Senator Brown mentioned would be in the area of nursing homes. We should have a hearing on nursing homes. It should focus on a couple of topics. First and foremost, we should hear from the Centers on Medicare and Medicaid Services to ask them questions, ask Administrator Verma questions about transparency and why information, data about cases in nursing homes and deaths in nursing homes have not been on the public record to the extent that I and Senator Wyden and a number of our colleagues have asked for. We've had 40,000 plus deaths in nursing homes, 40,000 plus when you include nursing home residents and workers. There's been a failure to collect data. Nursing homes need a lot of things right now. They need funding, a lot more of it. They need testing. They need personal protective equipment. I've got a bill to do all of that. Senate Bill 3768. It's the only bill in the Senate that would provide that kind of help. $20 billion to help states with cohorting, where they separate the residents with COVID-19 for those who don't have it, and pay for surge teams and other best practices to get the professional help that is needed sometimes when a nursing home is in crisis. With that as a long predicate, Dr. Denigan Macaulay, the GAO did an analysis of infection prevention and control problems in nursing homes. Could you quickly summarize that report?
Yes, thank you. We looked at data from 2013 to 17, and we found that nursing homes had widespread problems. Over 82% had deficiencies, and in some cases, almost half of them had more than one deficiency. And it was basic infection control problems. For example, staff not washing their hands or not disinfecting equipment and sharing of bathrooms. And that's pretty traumatic if you're looking at now, if we were to go back in and looking at during COVID and the infectious rate of that disease, it would be pretty devastating.
Thanks very much, Doctor. And Mr. Chairman, as I conclude, well short of my time, I want to say two things. Number one is I'll submit questions for the record for Dr. Throckmorton. And Mr. Chairman, I will say this about your leadership in this hearing. I may disagree that we should be covering some other topics, but at least you're having a hearing that relates to COVID-19, unlike what's happened on the floor the entire month of May. All nominations, nothing on COVID-19, with the limited exception of a few votes on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the balance of my time.
Senator Warner. Senator Whitehouse.
No, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead,
Mr.
Senator.
Chairman.
Senator Warner, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, let me echo as well comments of Senator Casey. I'm glad we are focusing on these COVID-related issues. I want to talk to the panel and perhaps Ms. Dennigan McCauley and then our friends from the FDA about supply chain issues that I think this virus has exposed. It seemed to me that our national strategic stockpile was significantly underprepared for this virus. And I guess what I want to first start with is from our guests from the FDA. What kind of partnerships has the FDA looked at, particularly with outreach to both our DoD, your DoD partners, and your Intel community partners? I'm the Vice Chair of the Intelligence Committee, on how we would be better prepared in terms of strategic stockpile in any future virus. You explored any kind of partnerships there? And I'm not sure which of the FDA colleagues want to address that.
Senator, this is Doug Throckmorton. I can start, and the others might chime in if they have additional things. I can tell you about the interagency partnerships that we have formed, because I agree they're absolutely critical for the response to COVID. So we've been engaged with discussions with FEMA, for instance, from really day one in terms of the response to the COVID outbreak, and about distribution, giving them whatever information we can to help them make good decisions. I know that engages with the Strategic National Stockpile. That's also focused through Health and Human Services Administration through the ASPR is the name of the group there. And we've also been engaged with them, again, on roughly speaking a daily basis, because we understood the need for us to provide whatever support we could for the decisions they were making about the Strategic National Stockpile. Similarly, we've been in close contact with the DEA regarding controlled substances and the need for controlled substances. As I'm sure you no doubt know, there have been extensive needs for fentanyl and other opioids for pain and for ventilator settings and things, and we've had to do everything we could to support that work that they do regarding the availability of those products. And then finally, BARDA, the acquisitions group, is engaged with us around the work that Flow and other manufacturers have recently taken up with. But
let me just, if I can interrupt for a second, I don't have that much time. I just, one of the things I think we've discovered as, the administration basically had states versus states searching for PPE and for testing equipment, finding a lot of that sourcing came from foreign sources, China in particular. In terms of thinking this through, have you had any kind of outreach to the Intel community or the defense community about how we better prepare future? I think there's a lot of us on both sides of the aisle that don't want to be reliant on China for APIs going forward, on the circumstance of not having a domestic supply on PPE, testing equipment, and you're talking mostly domestic agencies. What about our Intel community or DoD?
I have not been part of those conversations. That doesn't mean that they haven't occurred, sir. Just I'd be happy to get back with whatever information we can.
Ms. Dennigan McCauley, do you have any comment there? Again, I'd also want to, speak to kind of advanced manufacturing facilities. I think there's in the second panel, going to highlight some of the work that's being done at Virginia Commonwealth University on advanced manufacturing in this space around APIs. But if I'm really concerned about the domestic sourcing of this these materials.
Yeah, and GAO has work that we have ongoing looking at not only the Strategic National Stockpile, and we're anxious to be able to get out of our homes and talk to the Intel communities that you're referring to, because they are key with their threat-based analysis and understanding how best to make sure that those supplies are there. So we have a robust body of work looking at API, where they're coming from, how we're going to stockpile, medical countermeasures, the whole shebang. It's going to be, and we will continue to report out through the CARES report every 60 days, as well as capping reports over the longer period of time.
Well, I'm about out of time, but I do hope that having that resilient domestic supply chain recognizing where we're sourcing a lot of this material and looking at this from a national security standpoint. I'll tell you, Mr. Chairman, I know that Senator Wyden, for example, and I are both on Intel, and I think this is a national security issue that needs serious attention. I hope the committee will come back and revisit it. I yield back my last second.
Okay, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Hassan.
I'm right here, Mr. Chair.
Do you have me? Go ahead, Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Wyden, for this hearing, and thank you to our participants, our witnesses who are participating today. I just want to start out by saying that I share the concerns that my colleagues have expressed that this hearing is the first hearing that the committee has had since the onset of the pandemic. It's especially troubling given the pain that millions of Americans are feeling at this moment in time. The murder of George Floyd happened at a time when many African Americans already feel despair about the way this pandemic has disproportionately taken their lives and livelihoods. We could be working today on actions that would be constructive steps towards addressing their rightful concerns. But we are having this hearing today, and I do want to focus on the fact that in the last few months, FDA has authorized the use of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19 without properly evaluating its safety or effectiveness and allowed highly inaccurate COVID-19 tests to enter the market. These decisions have negatively impacted our day-to-day response to this pandemic and potentially put lives at risk. Yet we do not have an FDA official here today who can speak to those decisions. Moving forward, I hope this committee can conduct the type of broad oversight of the federal response to COVID-19 that the American people deserve, including an examination of what has happened in our country's nursing homes. Like so many other states, my state's nursing homes have been devastated, and the deaths in New Hampshire due to COVID-19 are unbelievably disproportionately happening in our long-term care facilities. So, Ms. Denegan-McCauley, a couple of questions for you. Your testimony before the House Energy and Commerce Committee in December touched on many of the shortcomings of FDA's foreign inspection process. Can you discuss the potential risks these shortcomings pose to Americans who rely on these pharmaceuticals and how FDA's decision to modify its approach to foreign inspections during the COVID-19 pandemic may exacerbate those risks?
GAO has reported that while FDA has many tools at its disposal to ensure the safety of our drug supply, inspections are absolutely critical. And they stood up the FDA overseas offices specifically to be able to have boots on the ground, to be able to get the intel, to find out which establishments are good, who might be a bad actor, and to be able to get in there and to do inspections with very little notice like we have here in the United States to make sure that it's equivalent. So the fact that it is stopped, I understand the need for being able to protect their own people, but it is concerning, and I would want to ensure that the other steps that they have in place are rigorous.
Well, I thank you for that clear response, because while I too understand the need to protect FDA inspectors, their work is essential. And given the risk to patient safety, I believe the FDA's decision to curtail inspections is inappropriate, and it sounds to me, given your answer, that you have deep concerns about it too.
We do have concerns, and we continue our work in this area.
Thank you. To Drs. McMeekin and Throckmorton, last year I had the opportunity to travel to China and speak with both U.S. and Chinese officials around the massive production of fentanyl, 90% of which originates in China and is unregulated. I've continued to push efforts around putting a stop to illegal production and distribution of fentanyl, devastating people in New Hampshire and beyond. Drs. McMeekin and Throckmorton, can you speak to what steps FDA is taking to combat illegal fentanyl from China? I would also be interested in hearing about the work your agency is doing in China, as well as efforts to stop illegal fentanyl from crossing our border, including sales on the dark web.
Thank you very much. Our enforcement efforts are primarily focused at our ports of entry and the international mail facilities. In addition, our Office of Criminal Investigations and our health fraud staff are investigating online sales of opioids, including fentanyl. In this space, we are working primarily on counterfeits and also working in conjunction with other law enforcement counterparts. In fiscal year 19, we had 55 arrests and 53 convictions related to these products or involving illicit opioids. So we continue to work hard on our web and health fraud activity surrounding these products.
Thank you, Dr. Throckmorton.
Doug, yeah.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I'm glad that you made the distinction between illicit fentanyl manufacturing, which is going to illicit drug use, from prescription fentanyl manufacturing, which is occurring obviously within the U.S. borders. Because I think there's been some confusion there. But in regards to the illicit fentanyl manufacturing, we have been focusing our efforts, especially at the borders and especially with online sales, working with the online sellers, the Amazons of the world, to try to prevent people from being able to order what are allegedly opioids like fentanyls, whether it's on the dark web or it's from other sources. We think that's a really important focus of effort.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that while we have the pandemic of COVID-19, we continue to have an opioid epidemic in our country. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. And now, is Senator Whitehouse available? Okay. Then is Senator Cassidy available? Senator Thune is here.
Senator Cassidy is here. Can you? Okay. Yes. Senator Cassidy is here.
Go ahead,
Can you hear Senator Cassidy.
Senator Cassidy.
Can you hear Senator Cassidy? Great, thank you. I'm sorry I'm not on video. Doctor, I think this is FDA. Dr. Toomey had mentioned about API coming from China, and Dr. Throckmorton pointed out that there doesn't seem to be that much of a shortage. But API is different than the chemicals that go within it. And it's my understanding that a greater percentage of the chemicals used to make API are coming from China. Is that correct?
This is Dr. Throckmorton. I'm not familiar with those data. We know substantially less about the sources of those products than we do about API. And as I think was mentioned earlier, we know less about API and its manufacturing and distribution than we do about finished dosage forms. So those.
Dr. Throckmorton, can I ask Dr. Abdu, because he's involved with trade. Dr. Abdu, are you familiar with what percent of starting materials or fine chemicals come from China?
I'm not familiar with that data, but we can look into it and get back to you.
That actually seems to be the critical thing here, because API is one step, but the chemicals are another. And so that actually seems to be our point of vulnerability unless we have a stockpile thereof. For example, is the high percentage of production in China of starting materials, because it is my understanding that there is a higher percent of starting material produced in China. What would be the reason for that? Is it cost, or is it access to a base mineral, or is it some other issue? It doesn't sound like y'all are familiar with this, but I would ask you to get back to us regarding that. I think GAO, though, has made a point that even in normal times, it's difficult to get a clear line of sight into Chinese manufacturing. So just to say, I do think it's important for us to consider establishing a strategic API or starting material reserve. Let me go on. Again, maybe you, Dr. Abdu. Brazil and Mexico both have presence of U.S. pharmaceuticals. Clearly, if there is geopolitical tension, it's probably better to have pharmaceuticals manufactured in Mexico and Brazil than in China for a variety of reasons. Can you give me a sense of the challenges for pharmaceuticals in Mexico and Brazil, and how is the foreign drug inspection process going there? would that be an alternative for us?
I don't have data on that at the moment, but again, can look into it and get back to you. Regardless, our inspection protocols remain the same globally, and we hold foreign and domestic manufacturers to the same standards.
Then let me finish with this. Ms. McMeekin, you went through a kind of elaborate why we cannot do inspections as we normally would in foreign countries in terms of it's jurisdictional and therefore we have to notify them. But two things about that. In the response right after that, Dr. Abdu suggested that when we were doing this in 2015, we indeed were doing spot inspections, but that there was a bias by how these companies were selected, and that bias therefore made invalid the results. But the point was we were doing spot inspections. And secondly, it does seem FDA has the ability to say, if you don't let us in, your goods are not coming to the United States. And so give me a sense of why your response to jurisdictional issues seem different than what Dr. Abdu said, and then also why cannot FDA just demand to be let in, or else we're not letting your product come over?
Thank you very much. Actually, you are correct. If we go to and inspect a foreign facility and they refuse our inspection, we do have the authority and have used the authority to put the firm and those products on import alert, which would prevent those products from entering U.S. commerce. And we do, just so folks know, we do conduct unannounced inspections. Generally, they in the foreign space, they generally on a for-cause basis. When there's a reason that's identified, such as an informant or there's a trade complaint, that we will go in and conduct. We have and we do conduct unannounced inspections in the foreign space. And again, if they deny an inspection, we do have authorities to place the facility along with the products on import alert. So that lets
how many unannounced inspections did FDA do on manufacturing plants in China and India last year?
Predominantly, they were announced. I don't have the exact figures. Remember that we don't have. We are just implementing in our IT system to actually have the capability to record whether an inspection has been announced or unannounced. So once we have that data, we will be actually able to identify what the outcomes of those inspections are.
I'm a little bit surprised that you don't have a list of how many. But I will yield back in the interest of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today, ensuring the safety and quality of our nation's supply of prescription drug supply is a key priority. And as the nation has worked to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, the issue of the supply chain for both prescription drugs and PPE has been brought to the forefront. And so I appreciate the discussion today. To Mr. Throckmorton, as we continue discussions on the coronavirus response efforts, what updates can the FDA provide with respect to provisions included in the CARES Act that aim to address supply chain issues, namely requirements for greater transparency regarding supply chain disruptions?
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that question. One, I will say, in general, we're very grateful for the provisions that we got in the legislation. We're in the process of implementing as you likely know, it implements in September. And so we anticipate that we're going to be able to make use of the legislative authorities that were granted in CARES to expand the amount of information that we get. And information is power in this setting. As we've discussed throughout this hearing, the more we know about products moving in the manufacturing chain, the better we can do as far as preventing shortages or anticipating spot needs or something like that. So CARES is a very important piece for us, and I'm looking forward to be able to come exactly what we were able to make do with it. But we have every expectation that it's going to be really helpful.
Okay. Dr. Dennigan-McCauley, are you aware of that provision in the CARES Act?
I am, but I don't have any work or further information.
Okay. So just as a sort of a follow-up to some of the line of question that I'm sure much of this ground's been covered already, but the perception has been through the course of the pandemic that there have been these shortages or disruptions in the supply chain, particularly with regard to pharmaceuticals and PPE, as it relates to those that are manufactured particularly in China, but other places around the world. So I'm wondering if you all could just comment about the accuracy of those reports and whether or not, in fact, the concerns that people have about the future with respect to those supply chains are valid, and whether or not we ought to be providing incentives to bring many of those capabilities back here and to stand up those capabilities in the United States. How reliable are these supply chains when with the manufacturers that are operating currently in foreign countries? Mr. Throckmorton or whomever.
Yes, I might start, Senator, if that's all right.
Yes.
First, without any question, COVID is an unprecedented demand on our drug supply chain. It's layered on top of an existing problem with regards to drug shortages, one that we've been working to confront for several years. But superimposed on that were unprecedented needs for medicines. And that's required that the FDA change our approaches, create new structures to identify and respond quickly to those spot shortages when they occur, whether it's propofol in the hospitals in the New York State area, or it's some other medicine. We've had to adapt our procedures to put in place ways to respond quickly within hours wherever we can to find new sources of products for the population, whether it's in a state or even in a smaller locality. Going forward, you're also correct that we've got to think about the next challenge. So COVID won't be the last time we're asked to respond to a natural emergency or an emergency of this size. And so we need to find ways to strengthen the supply chain, find ways to incentivize a supply chain that's robust and reliable. And bringing things into the U.S. is one way to address that. And we are firmly supportive of things like advanced manufacturing because we think the U.S. has an advantage in those areas, an advantage that could help steer firms onto the U.S. shore, helping all of us, both with regards to security, availability, and quality for medicines that we need now and medicines we're likely going to need for the next emergency.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, so thank you.
Next person is Senator Daines. Okay, if Senator Daines doesn't speak up, I'll call on Senator Young. And if Senator Young doesn't speak up, I'll call on Senator Crapo. Then the next one is Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for the conversation today. Let me just say this as well, as a state who has seen the enormous impact of COVID-19 devastating our economy and our health community. I too would ask that the chairman consider having a further oversight and hearing when it pertains to our nursing homes. Our nursing homes in Nevada were ravaged by COVID-19 as well, and I think it is important that we have further follow-up on this area and many others. So I would just put that in and echo request some of my colleagues as well. Let me start with Mr. Abdu. As we look ahead to the development and mass production of a COVID-19 vaccine, how does the agency expect to balance the efforts to scale up production quickly with the need for the oversight of these manufacturing facilities?
So, thank you, Sandra, for that question. And as you know, vaccines are regulated through our Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and our experts there would be the best situated to get you that information. I'm happy to bring the question back to them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that's going to be very helpful for us as we plan for the future. Let me ask you this, and I appreciate Senator Cassidy's line of questioning, because I too have questions as I've read through the GAO report about this unannounced inspections and announced inspections. So whatever information that you provided for the follow-up, please provide it to my office. My understanding after reading the GAO report is that most of the unannounced inspections, when we're talking about unannounced inspections, it is giving them, 12 weeks or more that you were going to be presenting to their facility. Is that correct? So they have enough time to prepare for knowing that an inspection is going to occur. Is that correct?
Thank you for that question. It's not a matter of having them enough time to prepare. It's really having enough time for us to prepare to make sure that we have the visas available and that our staff have actually been able to take the State Department clearance training. The foreign inspections require significantly more time to plan, and investigators must complete the necessary documentation for obtaining official passports, visas, complete required State Department training. Any delays in this can actually put a jeopardy or a last-minute change in travel.
Thank you. So can I ask that? And I appreciate that, because that's very helpful. But by giving them advance notice that you're coming, do you have concerns that they are going to take action in response to that notice? And what type of action would you have concerns that the facility would be taking?
Again, remember that the foreign firms and the domestic firms are inspected the exact same way, using the same standards and requirements, whether they're domestic or foreign. So the expectations is for the firms to be able to have quality products developed at any time during that process.
Right. So what's your distinction between then a spot inspection and versus an unannounced inspection? I mean, to me, an unannounced is you have concerns that something is going on there and you don't want them to correct it just while you're there inspecting and then go back to the bad practices. Am I missing something here?
The firms have a responsibility to have processes in place that they can develop quality products. Having the inspections is one aspect. It's a moment in time. So they have to have the quality systems in place throughout the life cycle of their product. It is not just, while we're there. While we are there, we're looking at these quality systems, but it is up to the individual facilities and manufacturers to have a role and an ownership in providing quality products.
So then why have an unannounced inspection?
So the unannounced inspections, think of it, so if we're going to do a pre-approval inspection, so something that's tied to an application. It's important that we do give notice on those pre-approval inspections because we want to make sure that they have the data available, that we have the people to talk to at the firms that can talk to the types of processes that they have or the manufacturing capabilities, so that we can talk with them to see how they are prepared to manufacture the product that is associated with the application. So that's what we do with a pre-approval inspection. So we do announce that, and then we also do announce when, or we won't announce if we have concerns that there might be, issues that have been brought to our attention from manufacturing, or if there have been patient complaints or consumer complaints or manufacturing complaints. We will want to go in there unannounced.
And why would you want to go in unannounced?
Sometimes just to not give them any specific insight, primarily.
because you have concerns that they might do something in response to knowing that you're coming?
There may be some, what we have seen from our outcomes is that, in general, there is not a huge difference when we have an announced inspection or we don't. If we look at our official action indicated where there has been violations, from a domestic standpoint, that is at, about a 7% for medical, for drug products. Versus, in the foreign arena, that is more about, 10%.
Thank you. I notice my time is up. Thank you. It looks like I've gone over. I appreciate the indulgence. I've got other questions for the record, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'll wrap up here with this first panel. And I want to thank you for coming to the committee today and providing your perspective and expertise on this very important topic. China's cover-up and their response to the coronavirus outbreak set the world behind and caused this pandemic to rage across the globe and devastate economies and public health. The Chinese Communist Party's reckless actions to downplay and lie about the severity of this virus has changed the lives of every American. Montanans across our state are losing their jobs. Businesses are closing their doors. Working moms and dads are struggling to put food on the table. As more information comes to light on the deadly Chinese cover-up of this virus, we must hold China accountable to ensure this never happens again. It's long overdue we end our reliance on China to produce our medical supply equipment like PPE as well as life-saving drugs. Over 70% of our personal protective equipment and over 1/3 of our antibiotics are imported from China. Being dependent on China is a threat to our national health and our national security. America will be safer and America will be stronger when we bring our pharmaceutical and medical manufacturing supply chains and those jobs back to America. Commissioner Abdu, there are substantial concerns that China's pharmaceutical industry is not effectively regulated by its government. China's regulatory apparatus is inadequately resourced to oversee thousands of Chinese drug manufacturers, even if Beijing made such oversight a greater priority. This has resulted in significant drug safety scandals. What are the most challenging aspects of maintaining quality control of Chinese pharmaceutical imports into the United States?
Thank you for that question, Senator, and I'll start off and turn to my colleagues. Through our office in Beijing, we work extensively with the National Medical Products Administration in China to raise the standard of their ability to regulate products within their jurisdiction. We do this by promoting harmonization with international standards, by promoting membership in fora like the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperative Scheme, which helps create standards for inspections. And we do this also in addition to work with NMPA through educating industry about requirements for FDA so that they can better comply and improve the quality of the product that they are exporting to the United States. With regard to what we do here domestically in terms of importation and so forth, I'm going to turn to Dr. McMeekin.
So, as Mr. Abdu mentioned, FDA's jurisdiction of a foreign firm's products begin when the products arrive at our borders in an attempt to enter into interstate commerce. And so FDA uses additional tools to help complement those inspections. And this includes utilizing our import screening tool called Predict, and we can and have adjusted that accordingly. We also conduct physical examinations and/or product testing at the borders to make sure that as products come in. We are also we can request records from facilities. So we can request records. We've received authority to request records in advance so that of an inspection or actually in lieu of an inspection. And so we're collecting these to look at batch records and stability program data to be able to see if they're complying with GMPs. So thank you.
Yeah, so you're not actually auditing the process operations, the plants for GMPs. You're looking at documentation, but not actually having any physical presence on their sites. Is that correct?
During this pandemic.
Okay. I have a follow-up question back to the Commissioner. What are the biggest impediments to drug manufacturing in America? And what would be the benefits of having a stable domestic supply chain for our most critical drugs?
Thanks for the question, Senator. I think Dr. Throckmorton might be in a better position to talk about drug manufacturing in the United States.
Thank you, Senator. When we've talked before about this, we've identified a few factors. One, obviously, is labor costs. Another factor relates to the environmental regulations. In some parts of the world, obviously, there are very differing standards in that regard. And third is the economics of drug manufacturing. So if you look back at the drug shortage report that we created last fall and things, we believe there is fundamentally a disconnect in terms of the incentives to create high quality and the reimbursement for the products that are of high quality. And we think we can change that if we could provide additional transparency, potentially grading, identifying products that are made to a very high quality, and make those known to the American public so that buyers would know that they could potentially choose those products over products that barely meet the mark. And we'd be very happy to talk to you about that, some ideas that we have along those lines.
Thank you. I'm out of time as well, and so this will conclude our first panel. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and sharing their very insightful testimony and answering these questions. And we're now ready to seat panel 2.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will get started here with the second panel. I'd like to start with the introduction, first of all, of David Light. David is a biotech entrepreneur and scientist with over 10 years of experience in the field. He is the founder and CEO of Valisure. Valisure tests its drugs for toxins, carcinogens, and dilution rate before dispensing to patients. David helped found, fund, and invent the core technology at Valisure and is named inventor on numerous patents. Our second member of the panel today is Martin Van Triest. He's president and CEO of CivaRx. CivaRx is a nonprofit, non-stock corporation founded in 2018 and is part of a new U.S. government-funded partnership to produce essential generic medicines and their ingredients in the U.S. The immediate priority for the partnership will be a COVID-19 response. Today, over 50 health systems are Civica members, representing more than 1,200 U.S. hospitals and over 30% of all licensed U.S. hospital beds. Since we don't have time restraints, each witness has 5 minutes for their opening statement, and we will begin with Mr. Light.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee, thank you for the honor of being able to speak before you today. I'm the founder and CEO of Valisure, where our mission is to help ensure the safety, quality, and transparency of medications. And we do this with a very simple but novel approach. We check. Valisure is the only pharmacy that checks the chemistry of every batch of every medication at no additional cost to patients. This is particularly important given our nation's heavy reliance on overseas manufacturing and COVID-19 putting additional strain on an already stressed system. Valisure currently rejects over 10% of the medication batches we test due to a variety of product defects. The pharmaceutical supply chain is extremely complex and heavily reliant on the self-regulation of overseas manufacturers. When you buy a bottle of medication, it's like buying a used car. Those pills are often already a year or two old, have traveled thousands of miles, and touched dozens of hands. No one buying a used car is satisfied to know that the original manufacturer said it's good. You want a Carfax report. You want to see a 100-point inspection on that car. None of that transparency is available for medications. While the FDA cannot do everything or be everywhere, we strongly believe that more can and must be done. The idea of independently checking drugs may be new to industry, but not to the academic world. However, warnings from academics have unfortunately been largely ignored. A grim example of this is the drug Zantac. In 1977, senators sat in this very building and listened to testimony that certain drugs are unstable and form the extremely potent carcinogen NDMA. Similar concerns were raised a year later at a summit held by the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Zantac has the exact chemical structure to form NDMA that the scientific community warned about, and yet the drug was approved only a few years later. In the following decades, dozens of studies implicated Zantac as chemically unstable and easily prone to forming NDMA, but these papers had practically zero impact. By the 1990s, Zantac had become the top-selling drug globally and among the most commonly prescribed to treat acid reflux in pregnant women and infants. It was not until 2019, 36 years after the drug's approval, that Valisure performed the simple action of independently checking generic Zantac syrup prescribed to our co-founder's infant daughter. The results were so dramatic, we immediately took the drug off our formulary. But we were not satisfied by simply publishing our findings in a journal. We petitioned the FDA directly, we spoke to press, we did not back down from the crystal clear science that Zantac is fundamentally unstable and should be taken off the market. 2 months ago, after dozens of countries had already banned this dangerous drug, the FDA finally granted our petition and Zantac was officially taken off the U.S. market. Without independent testing and the drive to make it broadly transparent, Zantac would have remained on the market for many more decades to come. The immense value of independent testing does not have to be limited just to Valishure's pharmacy. I believe there are two clear paths to applying independent analysis throughout the U.S. First is a data-driven approach, drug quality scores. Results from independent chemical analysis can be combined with broad regulatory data and boiled down into quality scores that can be as simple as a red, yellow, green rating that provide transparency to any drug purchaser. Buyers can use this guidance to buy green, occasionally yellow, and avoid red. A landmark paper by leaders from 8 prominent healthcare institutions was just published on this approach last week. Additionally, for a handful of important drugs that are particularly vulnerable to quality issues, there is a more definitive solution, what we call certified drugs. By employing independent batch testing of drugs up to the manufacturer level, we can weed out poor quality batches and bring certified medications to millions of Americans, regardless of which pharmacy they go to. This is entirely reasonable to do for critical drugs such as metformin. Metformin is the top diabetes drug and the 4th most prescribed medication in the U.S., with over 80 million prescriptions a year. Valisure has published 2 studies showing that approximately 40% of metformin products are contaminated with the carcinogen NDMA above FDA acceptable limits. This means millions of Americans are taking a drug every day that contain a carcinogen that absolutely should not be there. In summary, we have very serious problems in the drug supply chain that are caused by a very complex set of factors, all of which are made worse by COVID-19. It is imperative that we act quickly to better protect the American public. And above all, independent scientific analysis cannot continue to be ignored and must be a part of a new, transparent path forward. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Martin Van Trist Van Trieste, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee. I am Martin Van Trieste, the CEO of Civica. I am honored to be here and to follow a group of dedicated public servants. Civica is a nonprofit 501c4 established by health systems and philanthropies to reduce chronic drug shortages in the United States. Our mission is to serve patients by making quality medications that are always available and affordable. More than 1,200 U.S. hospitals in 50 U.S. health systems have joined Civica. We also supply the Veterans Administration, Department of Defense, as well as 340B eligible hospitals. Many of our drugs are used in the management of COVID, and we have been able to supply them without fail. We even contributed 1.6 million vials of medication to the Strategic National Stockpile. Several features of the Civica model may offer insights into the broader supply chain. We rely on long-term take-or-pay contracts to provide the certainty for us and our suppliers to invest in quality systems, capacity, and staff. We have backup suppliers to create redundancy, and we maintain 6 months of safety stock. Civica prefers to buy American where possible, then from other highly regulated economies, and avoiding Chinese ingredients in all our drugs if possible. Finally, Civica selects medicines to make based on the needs identified by pharmacists and physicians on the front lines. To further support a resilient supply chain, Civica recently entered a partnership with FLO and the federal government to make essential drugs here in the United States. This agreement will result in an end-to-end U.S. manufacturing supply chain for essential drugs, which will be sold at Civica's nonprofit pricing. As Congress considers other measures to improve the supply chain, we urge you to keep these principles in mind. Define and focus on a set of essential drugs. Support U.S. manufacturing. Ensure redundant supplies and stockpiles, and purchase from companies with robust quality systems. My written statement addresses specific policy tools, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
I ask questions. I want to make a comment, not to you two people on this panel, but to my colleagues on this committee, raising issues of whether or not this committee with this hearing or anything else that we've done since the pandemic hit, whether or not we've been putting our attention in the proper direction. And obviously, a lot of my Democrat colleagues feel otherwise. So it appears that these number of Democrat colleagues who have commented today, and maybe some who did not comment because of the usual courtesy that goes on in this committee that was absent today, whether it's the colleagues that commented or not, they surely have been out of touch with what the committee has been doing recently based on their comments. I mentioned in previous response to Senator Brown the billions of dollars this committee was involved in with responding to the COVID crisis and the economic turmoil that has resulted from it. And I guess some of my colleagues think that you just somehow pass a bill and then you forget about it, but our staffs and at least some members have spent weeks following up and assisting in implementing the $3 trillion relief package that we passed. In addition, I've heard other complaints today, so I guess these colleagues on other issues aren't aware that I've been working with the ranking member, Wyden, to have an unemployment insurance hearing next week. I also have sent oversight letters regarding the nursing homes that I'm waiting information on before any potential hearing, because you ought to have your ducks lined up before you take all the work that goes into a hearing, if you want that hearing to be productive. So it kind of is a bottom line like this. I'd request before complaining in the future, it would be helpful to talk to me or have your staff talk to the staff of this committee. So in the end, then, if you did that, you'd have a better idea of what we are talking about and what we've been doing, besides what's already on the public record in regard to our response to the pandemic and our response to the economic turmoil caused by shutting down of the economy by our government and our efforts now to open it up. So I'm going to start my questions with Mr. Van Trieste. Civica has collaborated with HHS, Veterans Affairs, Department of Defense, Center for Medicare Services, and is working with the Trump administration's Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority on a new manufacturing plant in the United States. For the purpose of the plant is, as I understand it, to expand generic pharmaceutical manufacturing in the United States and create stockpiles of active pharmaceutical ingredients for public health agencies, which I guess in turn would put us less dependent on China and other countries. So my first question is, has the Trump administration been a good partner in trying to overcome the issues of generics in short supply?
I started my testimony today by acknowledging the hard work and dedication of many public servants who are working to protect the American people. Even before the pandemic hit, we had been talking with officials at BARDA, ASPR, and HHS who are focused on securing the pharmaceutical supply chain. They have been interested and very helpful. Because we have a direct relationship with pharmacists and physicians on the front lines of the pandemic, we have been able to provide information that helped inform their priorities concerning what are the essential generic medications during COVID. I'd have to also add that since COVID, my faith in public servants has only gone up. These individuals have worked 24/7 around the clock to make sure that they could do the best job possible to bring PPE, medical devices, testing, and drugs to the American public who needs them the most.
My last question to you would be this, and based upon your experience working with various government agencies, how could Congress assist in strengthening and promoting U.S. drug manufacturing companies to return to the United States?
So I think clearly I hear frequently from a lot of organizations or individuals interested in starting their own nonprofit pharmaceutical company. Some are interested in the problem of drug shortages, others in reducing drug prices, and still others are looking to solve a market failure, such as the need for new antibiotics or therapies for neglected diseases, for which the traditional commercial model isn't working. Non-profit pharma has a great potential, not as an alternative to for-profit industry, but as an adjunct or a complement to it. But there are several things that would help this emerging model succeed. We should recognize that nonprofits can't raise capital the same way that the private sector does. Civica benefits from the financial commitments of our health systems and philanthropies. But in some cases, the government itself may want to look at the model as a solution to the problem. Using grants, low-interest loans, or other private mechanisms would help the non-profit pharma industry blossom. But in addition, there is a great number of bills been introduced in Congress recently, some very bipartisan, like with Senator Warren and Senator Rubio, that talks about incentives to reshore American pharmaceutical industry and bolster supply chain. Civica has publicly said that they acknowledge and applaud those efforts.
Thank you very much. And my last 2 or 3 questions will be to Dr. Light. So I'll ask you, I understand that your business model includes testing drugs before dispensing them to patients. Would you provide the committee a couple examples of toxins and other impurities your testing process has detected in drugs to make them more safe and more effective?
So we test actually for a whole variety of components in drugs, including dosage, the inactive ingredients, the dissolution rate, which is how a pill dissolves in one's stomach or intestines, and a variety of carcinogens, such as NDMA that has been discussed extensively. I will say that everything that we have looked for, we have found problems with, some more than others, and I think there's been a lot of attention, rightly so, to the carcinogens. And just last week, there's been recalls on a new drug, metformin, due to the same carcinogen NDMA. And we test for a variety of these on all the batches through our pharmacy.
My second question would be your relationship with FDA. When you discover contaminated drugs, do you report it to the FDA? And if so, what has been the FDA's response?
Because we are actually outside of the manufacturing system, we are not a good manufacturing facility because we don't manufacture. We are a pharmacy that has a laboratory. And so the guidance we received from the FDA is to report these findings to industry, which have the freedom not to pay close attention to them, given that we're not a GMP facility. I think it really underscores the point that independent analysis, certainly a lot from academics, have been largely ignored because we are not part of this pharmaceutical regulatory bubble. However, we have effectively utilized the mechanism that the FDA has of an FDA citizen petition, where when we have sufficient data in depth on particular problems like Zantac or metformin, we file a petition with this data and ask actions of the FDA, such as to make these recalls.
Can you describe the process used to test those drugs, and how much does the process cost?
So the process we use will certainly depend on which particular analysis. We have some amount of proprietary technology that we also use industry standard technologies with. We have optimized these systems so that we add less than a penny per pill of cost generally. And we sell these medications at no additional cost to patients. So this cost of independent analysis adds very little to the actual pill cost of being able to dispense it to a patient, certainly at the pharmacy level. And we believe that at larger levels, potentially even doing this with manufacturers, there'll be very small additional costs.
My last question to you, how do you see your system impacting drug manufacturing?
We certainly hope it improves the system as a whole. I think we've already seen the proof of principle in that in key drugs like metformin and Zantac. And we certainly hope that quality manufacturers will see this as an opportunity to what has been discussed a few times during this hearing of rewarding quality manufacturers, whether that's through advanced quality management maturity or, from our perspective, a science and evidence-based approach where we can actually infuse this independent analysis in addition to what the manufacturers already do and make that transparent to patients, buyers, and payers throughout the United States.
Before I close, I want to thank the 2 witnesses right now that are still here, but I was away voting on the Senate floor when the first panel left. I didn't get a chance to thank them as chairman of this committee. I want to do that. So whether you're government or private sector witnesses, we appreciate your attendance today. COVID has created many logistical hurdles in making today's hearing happen. I appreciate. Oh, did I forget Senator Wyden?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of additional questions.
Well, I really apologize. I'm sorry. I'll leave my closing statement to when you get done. I'm glad.
Okay. And I just have a couple of here for the gentleman from Civica, Mr. Van Triest, if I'm pronouncing that right. And then I want to make a comment and see if we can make some constructive ideas a reality going forward. Let me just make sure we've got this. Mr. Van Triest, your company is part of a contract that the Trump administration recently awarded to make COVID-19 drugs. Which drugs are you manufacturing right now?
So the intent of the grant that was given to us by BARDA was not to be making drugs or APIs today. It was to put the infrastructure in place for the next pandemic or the next crisis. However, Civica already has a series of drugs that we provide our members for use during pandemic, and those involve antibiotics, broad-spectrum antibiotics, sedation agents, heart medications, and local anesthetics. We provided over 1.6 million vials at the request of the government to the Strategic National Stockpile to do that, and we are prepared to provide more if asked.
So I just want to make sure we're clear. You got this contract, and you said something about working on infrastructure for the future, always useful, but I'm not clear what you're doing with the contract as it relates to COVID-19 drugs now. Have you given some COVID drugs to the government that we don't know about?
Yes, we provided over 1.6 million vials of drugs to support COVID patients, like broad-spectrum antibiotics, sedation, heart medications, and local anesthetics. These are the same products that we provide our members on a routine basis. They include vancomycin, ketamine, labetalol, lidocaine, midazolam.
But you were doing that before the COVID-19 pandemic, weren't you?
We were not supplying the national stockpile, sir.
You had the drugs.
We had the drugs.
Okay, I'm just trying to find what value added the government got for its money, and I think we'd also like to know what drug contractor making.
So the prime contractor is making an API facility that will produce active pharmaceutical ingredients and their precursors, which we are really dependent upon on China, as people talked about earlier, especially the precursors. And this is using brand new technology called advanced manufacturing, but it's not for today, it's for the future. And this contract has not been designed to set up manufacturing for today, but in the future, Senator.
I appreciate that, and to me, I'm always interested in the future, but I'm interested in the urgency of communities devastated by COVID-19 now and getting them help now, and I'm still unclear how anything you're going to do with these new efforts will address that. Now, my time is short, and I'm going to have to just make one last point that addresses what the chairman talked about. Mr. Chairman, I'm looking for where the chairman is. Is the chairman still?
Yes.
Okay, there's the chairman. All right. I want to just make a brief comment to my friend with respect to the afternoon, because I have been here, like the chairman, for 3.5 hours, and I think that what my colleagues and I have raised is not a question primarily of courtesy, because I think all have been reasonable in tone. It reflects an urgency. The racial injustice, for example, in American healthcare is an immediate need. The African American community, as we've been talking about, has been hit by COVID-19 like a wrecking ball. And on our side of the aisle, we want to make sure the Finance Committee, which has such enormous power in healthcare over Medicare and Medicaid, exchanges, and literally $2 trillion, annually, is going to use the extraordinary muscle in order to make sure that the African American community that's been hit so hard and is responding right now to injustices all across the community is going to see us use our influence to get those communities of color a fair shake in American healthcare. And so we had colleagues on our side raise this repeatedly, and unless I'm missing something, because I could have been out for a minute, no one on the other side of the aisle raised it. I think that's unfortunate. So to try to see if we could end on a positive note, Mr. Chairman, can we agree, you as the chair and I as the ranking minority member, that we will task our staffs and members on both sides to move very quickly to put together a hearing and an agenda, an actual specific action agenda to use the muscle of our committee to deal with these racial injustices. You and I are the only ones left. We've been here for 3.5 hours. Is that something that we can take from this in a positive way, that going forward we will work together with our staffs, with our colleagues, hearing quickly and an action agenda to deal with these racial injustices that so many African Americans are telling us about literally hour after hour each day. Is that something we can agree on?
We always sit down and discuss anything you want to discuss, as you will sit down with me anytime I suggest we discuss things. I guess the only thing I would ask you to take into consideration is almost every program that we're involved in this committee, whether it's Social Security going back to 1936, or whether it's Medicare and Medicaid going back to 1966, or whether it's unemployment compensation that has been around, I think, since the 1930s. All of these programs are colorblind. You got to realize that. And we will continue to work in a colorblind way, because we're all Americans, and we got to pull together, and that we shouldn't leave anybody behind, and my goal is not to leave anybody behind.
Mr. Chairman, just if I might, I will tell you respectfully, it's very clear that these healthcare programs are not colorblind. We have seen study after study showing that communities of color are disproportionately affected by these health problems that we are talking about, and that services, for example, don't even come to their communities. We've been hearing, as I have in the last few days, that in the health legislation, the affluent hospitals did incredibly well. And in communities of color, there weren't very many hospitals, and those there were didn't have the services that folks need. So I will leave this and hope that we can work this out quickly and respectfully. I will say again, Mr. Chairman, the facts show that these programs are not colorblind. The hard evidence shows the disproportionate effect on communities of color by these health programs. And for that reason, we would like to work, as the Finance Committee has always done, in a constructive way to get a hearing quickly scheduled and an action plan to reverse these injustices.
It's against the laws of all of these programs to discriminate against anybody. I'll close with this. Before we formally close today, I once again, for the second time, thank our witnesses, government and private sector, for their attendance today. COVID has created many logistical hurdles in making today's hearing happen. I appreciate all that people have done for being a part of this very important discussion. In addition, I want to thank the clerk staff for their hard work, time, and attention to making this hearing happen. Today, we've discussed many important issues that have existed for decades. However, because of the pandemic, they're now more important than ever before. Congress must ensure that the executive branch takes all necessary steps to properly oversee drug supply chain. We must work together to ensure safe and effective drugs. We have a good idea of who the bad actors are in the drug supply chain. We also know that aggressive and unannounced inspections provide the best way to catch those bad actors. I fully expect HHS and its subcomponents to laser focus on them aggressively, engaging in inspections as well as enforcement. Today, we've highlighted one aspect of drug supply chain. That supply chain ends in the United States. Going forward, we must entertain serious policy discussions about how we can efficiently and safely bring manufacturing back to the United States. In the coming weeks, I will be working on the next focus, the personal protective equipment supply chain. With that, the hearing is over, and members have 1 week to provide questions for the record, and whether it's this panel or the previous panel, I hope you'll respond appropriately and as quickly as you can. Meeting adjourned.